10 o'clock, and Jeff is going to be here only for an hour. Uh, so he's from Texas. We talked about how bad the weather has been there. They've had a severe winter storm. Uh, Many people have died, millions of people without hydro, without water, and without heat. And I was looking at the television this morning, 69 people, they say, died as a result of this storm. And it's unthinkable in the United States of America. In the great state of Texas, 69 people dying because of a storm. And but that is life. We empathize with the people of Texas, and we thank Jeff to take the time out to be with us for an hour. Thank you, Jeff. And we introduced Jeff last time too, but he is from a sister organization called Contemplative Life. What we are into is contemplative learning. So contemplative life and contemplative learning, twin sisters, uh, they can't happen without the other. One cannot happen without the other. People who contemplate, they learn, and people who really want to learn something profound, they have to contemplate. Contemplation of profound learning is the only way. There is no other way. You cannot just hear a profound statement of truth and live by it unless we experience the truth in deep contemplation. And Jeff has created a huge library of different ways of contemplating. And so it's, uh, uh, it's proper for the two organizations to be sister organizations. So Jeff, uh, with that said, thank you very much for coming, and you're on.
I'm on. Thank you. It's really great to be here. And I do live in Austin, Texas, and it's been an interesting week. It's been a difficult week. And I, just as a disclaimer, want to apologize, one, that I can't be with you for the full time, and two, that I may not be as prepared as I would have otherwise. But I do have some things to share that can hopefully connect the dots by the time that we're done. But what I can do is speak from my experience and from what I believe I understand at this particular time. And so first I'll just begin by just reflecting a little bit on the last week, because I've been learning a lot. I've been learning a lot about myself when faced with a situation quite unexpectedly, without power, without heat. Fortunately, we had water, but many people haven't had water. And how that kind of abrupt change, how did I react to that? How did I meet it? Intellectually, physically, emotionally, spiritually, culturally. And so it's been a really interesting learning experience. And the other thing too, as I look about this, the last year has been so extraordinary in so many ways, because it's showing us how interconnected we are, how dependent we are on each other. Globally, the pandemic has certainly shown us that. And it's kind of interesting that, the great state of Texas, the Lone Star State, right, isn't connected with the grid of the other sectors of North America. And so in this case, it's cost us. This rugged individualism is part of a mode of being that is sunsetting, and there's a new one sun rising, which is based on cooperation, based on the realization of our unity, of our diversity, the very topic that we're talking about here. And I think that part of what's happening here through the impact of global climate change, through the impact of things like pandemics and economic calamities and natural disasters, it's telling us something, that we need to cooperate and that we need each other. In fact, it's forcing us to. It's showing where the weak links are and where the chinks of the armor are. So that's part of what I'm learning through this process, and I hope is part of what many people are learning through this process. So in terms of beginning, you might remember, years ago when there'd be a program, program would kind of start out, and then there'd be a pause and say, and now a word from our sponsor. And so I'd like to begin with a word from our sponsor, which is silence. And just begin with a few minutes of silence and a few minutes of conscious breathing. And I have a timer here, and it will ring a bell at the beginning in 3 minutes and ring a bell at the end. See you on the other side. Thank you. So I thought it'd be good to kind of go on a journey, maybe two journeys. One journey is to look at the changes that are kind of moving toward this deeper work, this work of contemplative learning, this deep work of seeding contemplative experience, contemplative understanding, right at the very heart of what we do and who we are. You know, for many years, I served on the board of an organization called the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, which is a pioneer in bringing contemplative education and contemplative pedagogy to higher education. And they were pioneers. They were, you know, out in front of anybody else doing this kind of work, doing it when it was unfamiliar and even unwelcome. And so they plowed the ground for 15, 20 years. And what happened is then higher education began to kind of catch up with where contemplative mind was out ahead. And more contemplative educators, professors, assistant professors in higher education began to recognize the need and the value of a contemplative approach to education. And also a receptivity too, because, you know, in the academy, you know, it's a tough nut to crack, let's put it that way. And so it takes a while, but when it does enter it, there's deep reputation. And what's happening now, we're seeing kind of what's happened with the mindfulness movement is happening with the contemplative movement in higher education, and ultimately, I believe is going to happen in primary, secondary education as well. And that is, you know, just rolling back the tape a little bit, you know, the work that I'm doing, the work that brought forth the inspiration for founding contemplativelife.org was based on personal experience. I became interested in the inner life when I was pretty young, and I had some experiences that gave me a frame of reference of something that was possible. But with that frame of reference also came a lot of curiosity, questions. What is this experience of the great mystery like from different frames of reference, different points of view? And so that curiosity set me down the path of spending time in monasteries and ashrams and temples and working with an indigenous elder, not just as an explorer or as an observer, but as a practitioner. The idea is I really wanted to know and wanted to understand what the experience of the rites and the practices and the rituals were like, and how the goods were delivered through these mediums. And so with that, you know, you can't take shortcuts. You have to become a practitioner, and you have to be humble and receptive too, which means it takes time. And so what happened is that through all those experiences and all these different practices, exposure to them, and also putting them on experientially and recognizing the gift that is being offered. And then, you know, working with really young children with practices, and then preteens and teenagers and lots of millennials, and seeing the receptivity. But then also working with a lot of the pioneers of the mindfulness movement, the pioneers of the contemplative movement, which tend to be older. Why? Because this work takes years. And anybody says otherwise may not have done much of it. And so they are going to tend to be older for lots of good reasons. But the other thing I noticed is that oftentimes they don't keep pace with technology for a lot of good reasons. And so they're often representing themselves in kind of a Web 1.0 way and not reaching this young, diverse population of people that actually have the need and the interest. And there's a great need and there's a great interest. But how that's being answered and addressed is a big question mark. So I have some slides I want to share with you, and I'll see if I can try to bring some of these ideas together. So first is that the contemplative experience is something that is fundamental. One of the things that I realized, I came to the realization that everyone is contemplative. Why? Because everyone has an inner life. It comes with the deal. So everyone is contemplative, but the way that every person experiences that mystery, that inner experience, is very different. And that inner exploration, because we're all explorers, is as vast as the exploration of the outer world, science and space. But it's a journey that only each individual can go on. That's the contemplative journey. And in terms of a practice, I also realize that when it comes to practice, there's no one size fits all. What is right and appropriate for one may not be for another. And the practice that is appropriate is often a result of how a person is wired. You know, am I a heart person? Am I a head person? Am I a hands person? Is my life in crisis? Is it in flow? What's my educational, religious, cultural upbringing? All these things impact it. And it changes over time too. So at some point I may need a somatic practice. Another point I may need a different type of practice. But there is no panacea. There's no one size fits all. But silence really is the common practice of the contemplative experience, and the one that universally humanity is embraced. Whenever there's a major event of some kind, what do? We get silent together. And it cuts through the limitations of language and also the limitations of rites and rituals and things that we may not know or understand. So the moment of silence is the great common ground. And the root of all the great traditions is contemplative, because most of the traditions have come out of some type of revelation, a mystery. And so by its very nature, it's contemplative, because contemplative and mystery and mysticism, it's the same thing. And so they all have these rites and rituals and practices as well. So we're now at a point where great change is taking place. So people that were plowing the ground of mindfulness for many years, it's sprung out of teachings of Buddhism originally, and then it was relanguaged essentially to make it so that it doesn't have language barriers, which allowed the secular world to be able to receive it because it wasn't associated with the home team. And then, over years, the mindfulness movement began to enter into the mainstream. And one of the things that I've recognized in working with a lot of young people is they're deeply interested in spirituality, but they're looking for something that's authentic, meaningful, and experiential, which lends itself to practice. But it is confusing. And we're seeing it now is that you know, all kinds of things, yoga, meditation, all different types of contemplative practice and experience is becoming more mainstream. And mainstream also because it's interpenetrating the important sectors of human experience. Certainly, it's always been associated with spirituality and religion, but now it's entering into science and technology. And more than a few people are realizing, particularly with this quantum science, the quantum physics, quantum mechanics, is the terminology that they're using to describe what they're witnessing is very much like what the mystics have tried to describe when they're trying to put words to the ineffable. And so they're finding that they're, kind of operating in a very interesting sandbox now. Business and professional, you'll see, mindfulness is becoming something that executives and teams and organizations realize very, very beneficial. Not the least of which is the fact that our world, particularly, in the last 50 years with technology increases with social and mobile and, all the digital impressions from the time we wake up to the time we go to bed, our senses are assaulted with impressions. Think me, feel me, notice me. And so part of what's happening is that there is an innate need, a need that we oftentimes don't consciously know that we need, but there's a sense that we need something that's not there to counterbalance this assault in our experience. We're finding, the value of this in education. And it's so important, particularly for early education, because these are where the impressions are being made on the essence. And it's like, a piece of clay that, you make an impression in it, and that impression stays there. That's why the foundations for this reflective, contemplative experience are so important, to invite young people to enter what I would call the natural state earlier, instead of being scarred and have all these confusing impressions that you have to unwind from for 30, 50 years. And also, the other thing too is that what we're realizing is that it's not new, it's actually ancient. In the East, we call it the Sanatana Dharma, the eternal religion. The very essence of education and university, it started as a contemplative endeavor. It was an exploration of an inquiry into the mystery of creation, both outer and inner. So the very heart of education and very heart of university was contemplative. And so part of what's happening is getting back to it. And we're seeing this renewal or restoration or getting back to happening in a lot of different sectors. The midwife movement, because we got away from the natural childbirth. It's happening now with, we're reclaiming how we die, because we've handed that over to the secular world. And it's a sacred, sacred thing. And so now we need to reclaim education. We need to reclaim how we experience this mystery. And we're seeing that it plays across in any area of human interaction. I remember when I first organized Contemplative Life, I did a Google search and I was kind of blown away. Contemplativelawyers.com. There's lawyers that are contemplative practitioners. There's all kinds of things going on in prisons because it facilitates reform, changing the inner world and then changing the outer experience has a huge impact on health and wellness, a huge impact in terms of how we live, but also how we die. So part of what's happening too is that the important aspects of our human experience have become siloed and cut off from one another. You know, we have our spiritual life, we have our personal life, we have our social life, and we have our professional life. But what's interesting is how quickly that can change. Because if you look at, 10, 15 years ago, the social life and the professional life, there's no way that they would be intersected. But then what happened is that the social digital revolution happened. And then the next thing you know is that it kind of came through the back door of organizations, and they realized that they need to open up to this new social movement. And so now you see social and professional, they're just kind of weaving together. But the other dimension that hasn't yet been integrated is the spiritual, I would say the contemplative. I would call it the contemplative, because there's even some people that don't necessarily relate to it as spiritual, but everybody can relate to it as contemplative because everybody has an inner life. And, so it's something that they can relate with. And so part of what needs to happen, and part of what Shiv's work and my work and in your work is integrating this contemplative dimension into our work life, into our social life, and not just into it, but actually it becomes the very heart of it. And why is this important? Because our work life and our social life are very large portions of our human life. And if we're not able to bring the spiritual or the contemplative dimension into our work life and social life, then there's a very important part of our human experience that's not present, that's not fulfilled, that's not exchanging value. But part of the problem has always been with this is religion and religious language, because, there's a sense of kind of this home team consciousness here. But I think this is where the contemplative languaging can be very beneficial, so that we don't make it about my way or your way, but we make it about something that's more universal. And that involves, relanguaging. So part of what's happening now is there's an explosion of practices that are kind of coming online. And actually so many, it's too many. You probably can't really see this because the type is really small, but when I began contemplative life, I did this this diagram here that has contemplative practices and then kind of themes of the different practices. So on the bottom, you've got visualization practices and rites. You got mindfulness practices and practices of sound, which is chanting and psalmody and bhajans, hymns, chanting, things like that. And then meditation and prayer, breath meditation, the Ignatian examining, centering prayer, Vipassana, Lectio Divina, the Rosary, Zazen, Taze, and so creativity practices, storytelling, and then intentional things. A practice isn't always something formal that comes out of antiquity. And the thing about practice is you can have the contemplative experience without doing a formal practice. You can be doing a formal practice and not having a contemplative experience. And so it's not just about what we're doing, it's what we're bringing to what we're doing. And ultimately, in the mature state, if our life becomes our practice becomes our life. And that's really the aim, where it's one thing. It's not, hey, now I'm going to do this. It's just you're always doing this. And so, you can kind of look at that but the contemplative life practices link, and maybe we'll take a look at that, is a better place to kind of open that up. But so that's kind of above the ground. But what about below the ground? Because these things come out of something. They're rooted. They're rooted in science and technology, believe it or not. They're rooted, obviously, in ancient philosophy and religious traditions, practices, and insights. Universal spirituality, again, the Sanatana Dharma, traditions of the East, traditions of the West, some of the ancient sciences, and in current days, psychology, modern psychology, and is always the case, the root system underneath that you really don't see is very much more vast than what's above. At some point, I'm going to do another one, which is not just the tree and the branches, but the fruits, which nobody's ever done that. And I want to do that because it's really the fruits that we're after, and not all the fruits are the same. And so there's a lot of research to be done there. So part of this is, so now, yeah, we're moving into this point where there's an interest, there's a need, there's an explosion. And so with that, it's bringing, quite frankly, a lot of confusion. Where do you go? What do you do? What practice is right for what person? Who's to say? Who's qualified to teach, right? These are big questions. And, these are also things that, this type of work done by people that have done the work can be very valuable. So as I look at this, and as I, look at, the future of, contemplative education, contemplative learning, unity and diversity, I see three levels of the way to engage. The first level is, what is it? Information. So what's out there? Because you have to have a way of engaging, and it's a wide open field, and because it does require some individual discernment. And what do I mean by that? Good people, experienced teachers can differ on these things. If I came to a point in my life where I realized that I could benefit from a teacher or a teaching or a practice, and I went to a Zendo, what kind of practice do you think I'd be taught? I'd be taught Zazen, and I better be taught Zazen because that's what they do. But if I went someplace else, I'd probably be taught something else. And so part of it is that there requires a degree of discernment on an individual basis of kind of what speaks to them, what resonates. And so by providing information, it allows individuals to kind of navigate that space on their own terms. And the other thing about that, why that individual discernment is important, particularly in this day and age, is in the past, oftentimes the seeds of the spiritual life, the foundations of contemplative or spiritual or religious education came from our tradition. We were born into it. And, I know I was born into it. I grew up in a Catholic family, a devout Catholic mother, went to Catholic parochial schools and was force fed, you might say. I mean, I was willing, but I was force fed. And many people of our generation were. But many people of the current generation are not being brought up into traditions. In fact, there's an exodus from organized religion going on. And so they're not getting the formation that are needed. And they're not getting force fed. And so, having the information out there, but then once an individual finds something that they can relate with, that they can find value in, then it's time for formation. learning the practice, engaging the practice and the teaching for a long time. You know, there aren't shortcuts to this stuff. And it's important too, because everybody's looking for the next quick fix. The attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. And we know that there's not a shortcut to this stuff. There's not like a weekend workshop on an enlightenment and it got it now. So, you know, it takes time, and that's where community comes in. So the third level of transformation comes through the formation deep enough, long enough, and in community. Community is a critical piece of this thing, because anybody that has done deep spiritual work will realize is that it's hard to do. It's hard to develop a deep daily practice. But when you're in community with other practitioners, we help each other. Community is really important for the process of transformation. So now I want to take you on another journey here. And I know this is a very, you know, kind of big, confusing slide. I put this together early this morning. And so let me just kind of walk through this here, because we're part of an evolutionary process. Spirituality is evolving. Everything evolves. And so let me just kind of walk this through for a minute here. I'm just going to make this a little bit. Are you still able to see this okay?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It's good, Jeff.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, good. So one of the things that I wanted to say here is, I'm going to just move some things around here. So 1893, Parliament of World Religions, groundbreaking event. Chicago, a gathering like no other gathering in human history. Vivekananda, you know, comes on the scene and just blows people's minds. Of course, he was a disciple of Ramakrishna, and he was in the zone, and it opened things up, and it was a groundbreaking event in terms of the evolution of spirituality. And then in 1920, the League of Churches was formed. The ecumenical patriarch of the Eastern Orthodox Church of Constantinople wrote a letter and addressed to, you know, all the churches of Christ, wherever they may be, because they were, you know, divided and diverse. And so they, you know, began to bring those together. And the idea is that the League of Churches was kind of modeled after the League of Nations, which was the pre-UN body. And then, you know, the World Council of Churches in 1948, which was really an effort toward Christian unity. And then in 1963, the Second Vatican Council did some groundbreaking work in terms of, for the first time in their history, inviting and opening to non-Christian traditions. They began to, you know, take down some of the walls and made a declaration that was groundbreaking and recognizing the value of other traditions. I mean, it seems kind of ridiculous now, but it was really groundbreaking at that time. Then in 1993, which is 100 years from the first Parliament of World Religions, there was a reconvening in Chicago at the Parliament of World Religions. And one of the things that they did is that the trustees and a global network of spiritual leaders came together to kind of agree and distill what's called toward a global ethic. And a lot of I'll have links for all these things. I'll put in a check box at the end for those that kind of want to, find a thread to these things. And so, the global ethic, and so part of what you can see happening here is that there's this thread of borders coming down and thread of more kind of interaction between the different traditions. Kind of started with the Parliament, really, which was interreligious on the highest levels. Very interesting that it started with something like that, but then very soon after, this ecumenical, which is, kind of relations, kind of ecumenism is something that's kind of intra-religious, starting with the Christian tradition. And then interfaith, which is often associated with, kind of the coming together, the collaboration of the Abrahamic traditions. And then interreligious, which is both the Parliament of World Religions. You see here the URI, the United Religions Initiative, that started in the year 2000. This is the edge of interreligious. But at the same time that happened, the next edge began to form, which is interspiritual. And interspiritual was a term that was coined by a very, very dear friend of mine, Brother Wayne Teasdale. In fact, I'm sitting in the room that Wayne was to come and he had cancer and he was going to move from Chicago in with my family to heal from cancer. And he was going to be in this room, but he ended up passing 2 weeks before he was able to move. But he was a groundbreaking mystic pioneer. And in his spiritual classic book, The Mystic Heart, he coins the word interspiritual. And not only that, he also articulated something in there called the nine elements of universal spirituality. And you can see they're kind of building on each other. So you've got the global ethic, you've got the 9 elements of universal spirituality. Right around the same time, you have the Snowmass group, which was a group that—
Can we ask everybody to mute, please? Sorry, Jeff.
Met in, it was called the Snowmass group because they often met at St. Benedict's Monastery in Snowmass, Colorado. It was initiated under the vision and stewardship of Father Thomas Keating, founder of the Centering Prayer Movement. And what he did is he brought together spiritual leaders from lots of different traditions just to be together and have retreat together and have conversation together. And they spent like 10 years doing this once or twice a year. And out of this, they distilled something that has been become known as the 9 points of agreement. 9 points of agreement. And towards the global ethic, that had 200 signatories. So why is that important? It's important because it's hard to get religious people to agree on stuff, man. And so when you can get agreement on these things, this is really a very important work. And so what happened with Wayne Teasdale and the 9 elements of universal spirituality, it built on this body of work. And he, as he described it to me, he didn't like think this up. He was connected with spiritual leaders all over the world. He was one of the closest friends of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And what happened, he was his first teacher with Father Thomas Keating. He was both a Christian sannyasi. He took cross vows under Cardinal George of Chicago as a Benedictine. And these 9 elements of universal spirituality came through him, and they're jewels. They're really, really jewels. And so I'll just go back for a second here. And Ostrom, Elinor Ostrom, in 2009 won the Nobel Prize in economics. She was a social scientist and did field work. And her field work involved visiting communities and groups all over the world And what her particular interest was how different groups avoided what's called the tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy of the commons is essentially if you have a common pool resource, land, and you've got all these people and groups that are competing for the land, what happens, it ends up tanking the resource. We're experiencing that globally now, and it's called the tragedy of the commons. But what she discovered is that there are groups and communities all over the world with no connection with one another, and they all avoided the tragedy of the commons in very similar ways. And for that work, she won the Nobel Prize. Also the first woman to ever win the Nobel Prize in economics, which was breaking the glass ceiling. So, Elinor Ostrom, it's her receiving the Nobel Prize. These are the core design principles of pro-social, which are the organizing principles for cooperation that has come out of the collective conscience of humanity. Nobody thought these up. They witnessed them, they discovered them, they documented them. Again, I'll send you some links on these things at the end. But now let's move it forward. Interfaith Harmony Week, right? Groundbreaking event. Because, at the UN, prayer was forbidden. And so they didn't suffer, religious language or anything very much at the UN. But in 2010, they came together and inaugurated World Interfaith Harmony Week. And this, a very, very big thing. King Abdullah of Jordan, the great King Abdullah II, proposed this and, had a plenary session at the 65th General Assembly in New York City and gave, this incredible speech. And let me share what he said. He said, it's essential to resist forces of division that spread misunderstanding and mistrust, especially among peoples of different religions. The fact is, humanity everywhere is bound together, not only by mutual interests, but by shared commandments to love God and neighbor, and to love the good of the neighbor. And so, it was this, kind of foundation that he laid. And, when you hear this, like, yeah, that sounds right. And so World Interfaith Harmony Week was born. And then shortly after that, in 2014, the International Day of Yoga. Again, it's kind of a groundbreaking thing because this hasn't been the UN's thing previously, but they're opening up. This is evolving. And yoga is so important because, again, it's so universal. Now, Westerners only know just a little slice of what yoga is. They think it's about just asanas and exercises and things, and it is. But that's only one level of Patanjali's 8 levels of Raja Yoga. But it's a good beginning. But it's about union. It's about unity and diversity. It's about essentially what all this is about is I would say just pause for a second here. I'll come to that at the end. And then the next thing is the 2 things that I think are really at the cutting edge are something called pro-social spirituality and this contemplative learning and diversity. I put them on the chart here. So we'll have to look back in 5 years to kind of see where they are. But I think that they're really important, really groundbreaking. I'll go back to this presentation mode again. So another thing that's happened here is this convergence of science and spirituality. Here's a shot of somebody that I work closely with David Sloan Wilson with His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 2019, sponsored by the Mind and Life Institute. David is a world-renowned evolutionary scientist, but also has a great interest in the evolution of spirituality, which kind of is what brought us together. So he was invited to have this personal dialogue with His Holiness. And in the links that I'll share with you too is a clip that I edited from that has like an hour of their conversation. But this is a groundbreaking conversation because the nature of the discussion was about evolution and evolutionary science, not just a biological evolution, the long tail of evolution, but about cultural evolution. And what David knows from his work is that there is kind of a new understanding about evolution from a cultural perspective that demonstrates in the record that evolution can also happen in bursts. It's not just a long tail game. It can happen incredibly rapidly. And we're at the cusp of a convergence of all these things, not just science and spirituality, but technology, the arts, and other things kind of coming together. And with the right foundation, contemplative education, contemplative practice, contemplative community, conscious evolution is possible. And that's what we're on the cusp of right now. Initiative that I'm involved with brings a number of these things together. Brings Wayne Teasdale's 9 Elements of Universal Spirituality with Elinor Ostrom's 8 Core Design Principles. It's an initiative that is a joint venture between Contemplative Life and Pro-Social World that is sponsored by the Templeton Religion Trust. And it's a research initiative that is essentially exploring the integration of evolutionary science and evolutionary spirituality. Absolutely groundbreaking. And it's about to, be released, in the coming months. So let me see if I want to share something here with you that will at least give you a little taste of it. Can you see a white screen that says cooperate? Okay, good. So what Shiv is doing with contemplative learning, unity and diversity, what I'm doing with both contemplative life and with pro-social spirituality, I truly believe is at the edge of where this is going and why it needs a community of people that understand the value of it and can help serve it. I want to share something with you that comes from Brother Wayne Teasdale's The Mystic Heart, this classic book, and I'll share a link to this as well. because he also saw this. From chapter 10, says it will be contemplative. The coming spirituality will be contemplative because it represents the maturity of the inner experience. Every form of spirituality or mysticism that reaches the height of maturity does so precisely because it is contemplative. Contemplation is the capacity to know the divine in oneself in an intimate relationship with it, beyond the finite and the impermanent. The interiority of contemplative awareness is a process of simplification and clarification of the self that prepares the individual for union with God, integration with the absolute. Contemplation is awareness beyond the need for thought. It is free of rational analysis. It achieves its perfection in the silence of resting in the divine presence. And, you know, as I read through, Shiv, your proposal and, you know, your ideas in there, I want to quote a couple things from there as well. Humanity is relational. When I perceive you as different from me, I treat you as different. When I perceive you as the same as me, I treat you as the same. Contemplative education is leading into an inner experience of the invisible truth underlying all existence and will help us resolve the existential issues of global proportions we face today. Education of the future needs to include contemplative content to cultivate lived feelings of unity and diversity at its various levels of formal and informal discourse. We expect such a re-envisioning of education to create a culture of peace, harmony, wealth, wellness, and respect for all existence. It's meaningful both from the religious and the secular. While rational learning gives rise to reductionist states of mind, contemplative education gives rise to whole world views. So perfectly in line with Wayne and so many others. And I believe this, you know, the next edge. There was also this piece here that said that science is silent on mind and consciousness, characterizing the animate because it considers these topics being incorporeal and outside its scope. But I want to challenge that because I think that that's also emerging and evolving. There is an integration of science and spirituality. I'm certainly involved in some of those discussions where there's a growing body of people that realize that we're peering out through different lenses at the same thing, the mystery. And we're seeing now with the emergence of a new field called contemplative education, contemplative science, and, credited discipline areas in University of Virginia, the Contemplative Science Center, Emory, Brown University. So contemplative disciplines are actually something that are being accepted within the academy. Also, the new mind science and neuroscience and quantum sciences as well, consciousness studies like what's happening at the University of Arizona. So I think that they're somewhat silenced. It depends on what we mean by science. science is a big thing. And I think that there's different aspects of science, including evolutionary science, that is finding common ground with contemplative science and contemplative understanding. And so with that, that's a lot of yakking. I think I'll just pause with that, kind of at the end of time anyways, and turn it back over to you. What you want to do from here?
Thank you.
Excellent.
Jeff, thank you very, very much. Are you finished, or you got the some concluding statements to make?
Concluding statements. Well, I've got some concluding resource links, and I'll put those in the chat.
You paused on a description that you said you would come back to. Do you remember what you were going to say?
Yes.
Curious.
Yeah, thank you. Because I would have forgotten. Here's what I truly believe is happening, is that a new human story is beginning to emerge. And it needs to emerge because we've forgotten who we are. And it's not a story that any group or any individual or anyone from on high is going to say, well, here it is. It's something that is going to come from within the collective awareness of humanity. And it's beginning to happen. And it has very much to do with everything we've been talking about here. When and as that begins to grow, there'll come a point in which there'll be a critical mass. It'll be like that grain of sand on the scales that all of a sudden the scales start to tip in another direction. And when and as that happens, then it'll begin to unite human intention or toward an aim, a common mission, vision, common experience, which, by the way, is the first of pro-social's core design principles, is a shared experience, a shared intention. And ultimately, it's not just a cultural, social thing. It's not just an earthly, terrestrial thing. It's a thing that connects on all these different levels, into infinity. And it's unity consciousness. It's unity consciousness. That we're all, not just are we connected with each other in different ways, but everything is connected with everything. And it's all emerging out of the same mystery. And when we connect with that and we realize that, which is the contemplative experience, then the scales fall from our eyes and we're able to see our connection with everything else and everyone else. And that fundamentally changes behavior. And that is my closing statement.
Wonderful. Shiv?
Thank you so much, Jeff. I think very enlightening, very scholarly, and very contemplative. You have brought to light things that need a lot of study and a lot of research. You must have, you've been in contemplation for a long time, and the resource that you have collected, the historical developments in the contemplative field and the spiritual field, I think great enlightening scholarship that you have presented today. And thank you so very much for your scholarship and your contemplative focus. And great resource. Please help us in doing what we are doing, and that is all that I can say. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're in this together. It takes a village. And so I loved how you put, sister organization. It's beautiful. And I feel that way too. And I'd love to stay with you, but actually I've got to deliver some water to some friends.
I can understand that.
So thank you all so much. Have a
Thank you,
beautiful
Jeff.
day.
God bless you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you.
Go safe.
Jeff, one question, Jeff?
Yeah.
Have we been provided with contact information for you and or your organization in the materials?
I'll put my email in. Like that.
Okay, let me look, my brother, please. Yeah, that's good. Contemplative life. Okay, thank you, Jeff.
Yeah. So.
By the way, Bill, we hope that Shiv and I were talking. We hope that you, me, and Jeff have a chance, basically, to have a meeting in the next week or so.
Very good. Okay, thank you, guys. That's great. Good luck with everything out there in Texas, my brother. It's
God bless.
Thank you. Om Shanti.